Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of Al Monitor, and our guest today is Stephen Kalin, Wall Street Journal Middle East correspondent covering Saudi Arabia and the Gulf from Riyadh and Dubai. He has lived in the region since 2009 and previously reported from Iraq, Egypt, and Lebanon. Stephen and I will be talking about President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia and the region next month and what the Saudis are expecting from the visit. We'll also be talking about Iran, Yemen, and how the Saudis are managing the oil windfall that they are receiving from higher oil prices and how that may or may not be affecting their current development plans. My conversation with Stephen Kalin of the Wall Street Journal begins now. Stephen, welcome back to On the Middle East.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
So U.S. President Joe Biden is heading to Saudi Arabia July 15-16 for a meeting with King Salman and his son, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's known. And they'll be attending and hosting an impressive GCC +3 summit. Now, this, as we know, is a turnaround since Biden took office last year. That is a turnaround in U.S.-Saudi policy. And Saudi Arabia must be very pleased with this. You are there in Riyadh. You report from the capital. What is the expectation for the summit from the Saudi perspective?
Well, yeah, I think it is quite a turnaround given the way the past year has gone. You know, we reported a couple months ago that relations had hit a pretty low point. And, leading up to that, there had been shuttle diplomacy. And after that, there was also some more visits. I think an important one seemed to have been the visit by the CIA director, Bill Burns, a couple months ago. And so I think the Saudis have, just looking at their public statements and the way they've been framing this, they are very happy and excited to sort of showcase the reforms, the Vision 2030 plans that they've been implementing. Just if looking at the way the trip was announced, that they highlighted about a dozen different topics that the Crown Prince wants to talk to the president about, to sort of highlight the ways in which Saudi has been trying to take more of a leadership role in the region and in the world. So they're sort of, I think, was this sense of we have a positive story to tell, and I think the Saudis are trying to tell that.
What do you think the kingdom wants and expects from the United States on Iran? There have been discussions between Saudi and Iranian officials in Baghdad. The Iran nuclear deal seems to be on life support. Iran's going to be a big part of this summit, a big part of President Biden's trip to the region, which begins with a stop in Israel, which is also concerned about Iran. How do you see the Saudi perspective looking across the Persian Gulf at this point at Iran?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like Iran is kind of, one of the main focuses of the trip without, it obviously being a stop on the trip. It's kind of this one of the big topics, and the countries in the region have been talking about it, both with the U.S. and amongst themselves to a certain degree. The Abraham Accords certainly helped make some of those conversations a little bit easier, direct conversations. We saw a visit, I think it was just last week, by the Israeli president to the UAE to meet with now President Sheikh Mohammed. And there was a meeting a couple months ago in Negev, which the Secretary of State attended. There's a lot of talk about Iran there. And so I think that this is going to be probably a continuation of that conversation. The Saudis have been saying for over a year that they're concerned about the Iran deal, about the U.S. getting back into the Iran deal, and that while the nuclear file is, of course, important, they're very concerned about Iran's regional activities, militias, particularly the Houthis, these missiles flying across the the border into Saudi Arabia. And so they've been asking for the U.S. to better understand their position and their concerns, and to step up and sort of fill in the gaps. I mean, the U.S. The White House has been saying for the past year that the U.S. will support Saudi national security in this regard. The Saudis have been saying they don't really feel like that's that those promises are being fulfilled, because the U.S. has been relocating Patriot missiles and kind of repositioning in ways that don't make Saudi feel very comfortable. So I think they'll be looking for some tangible improvements or changes in that stance.
What about the diplomatic track? How much traction is there? How much faith is there in the diplomacy that it could lead to some type of understanding or de-escalation of tensions? There's now been, I think, 5 meetings in Baghdad between Saudi and Iranian representatives.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's sort of there were a few meetings back to back last year. Seemed to be gaining some momentum, and then they slowed a bit. And I think there was another one recently. I don't recall the exact date, but maybe a month or so ago. And so I think it's always good, obviously, when rivals and enemies are talking to each other. Better to have open lines of communication, and usually some talking is better than none. There don't seem to have been many tangible outcomes yet of those negotiations. From what we're hearing from folks on both sides, the Saudis have been asking for help with Yemen. They've been asking for from the Iranian side to get the Houthis to tone it down. They haven't gotten much positive response from that. Although there's also this Yemen ceasefire, which we can talk about. And the Iranians have been asking the Saudis for a restoration of diplomatic ties, which the Saudis seem to view more as sort of the end result rather than a first step. The most recent thing that I think was talked about was bringing. It was related to Iran's mission to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is based in Jeddah, and so sort of getting them to reopen that office, which is kind of a step towards restoring diplomatic ties, and also some sort of logistics on Hajj quotas for Iranian pilgrims. So that's been in the works for months, and we haven't seen any concrete progress. But I think it's useful to have multiple channels.
Stephen, you mentioned Yemen. There's actually some hope for Yemen. The truce has been holding now for, I think, more than 2 months. U.S. Yemen envoy Tim Lenderking is a frequent visitor to Riyadh. This is a potentially good news story. I mean, it's a good news story in that the truce, which is fragile, seems to be holding, and there may be potential for a further traction toward a political settlement. Tell us how Riyadh is looking at Yemen, how Saudi Arabia sees the war there and the potential for a settlement.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is good news. There have been, I'm going to butcher some of these statistics, but the first 2 months that the ceasefire started, I think, right at the beginning of Ramadan, and in the first month or two, there were lowest casualty rates in Yemen since the war began. Very few airstrikes, very few cross-border attacks. So all of that has been positive in terms of a reduction of violence. I think the big question is, how sustainable is it? And so it was again more positive news to see the ceasefire extended for an additional 2 months a few weeks ago. And while the ceasefire is in place, slowly some of the other files have been moving. We've seen flights between Sana'a and Cairo, as well as Sana'a and Amman, restored to a degree. Hodeidah port has received more shipments of energy and to a degree. I mean, not everything is is to the extent expected, but there's been progress in some of those fronts, and so I think all of that is positive. And the big question, which I fortunately don't have an answer to, is how this plays out, and it'll be interesting to watch whether this sort of ceasefire of 2 months by 2 months just keeps on getting extended, or at some point it gets extended indefinitely, and it just becomes sort of a de facto end to the Saudi campaign in Yemen, the Saudi-led campaign, or whether it provides the basis, the platform for a comprehensive settlement, which I think is obviously quite complicated, but maybe might give the Saudis a little bit more comfort in knowing that this is actually fully resolved. So I think I think there's been for a long time an eagerness from the Saudi side to end this war and to get out. It's cost them a lot in multiple ways, and so we might this might be a positive year in that front.
What can we expect with regard to normalization with Israel? The Saudi position has been pretty clear that there needs to be some steps on the Palestinian track first. President Biden is going to Israel and the West Bank, plans to meet with Mahmoud Abbas there. This has been pretty much the Saudi position since 2002, the Saudi-led Arab League peace proposal at that time. How do you see the Israel normalization track? What are the Saudis looking for as positive steps toward some type of deal or progress on the Palestinian issue that would allow them to take a further step towards, or a step toward normalization with Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The Saudi position really has been pretty fixed publicly on this issue. I think the Crown Prince has said in multiple interviews now that he's eager to have good relations with Israel and sees lots of potential areas of cooperation, but there needs to be, the Palestinian issue needs to be addressed adequately, and that I don't know that we've seen a lot of progress on that front. I think that the Saudis have at various points expressed frustration, which is not unique to them, with the Palestinian leadership, and as well as the Israeli, various Israeli governments. So I don't know that we're going to see much, progress in a major way. There have been over the last few years some sort of small shifts and accommodations, allowing Israeli overflights to the UAE after the Abraham Accords was a significant move. It wasn't, it's far short of normalization, but sort of an acknowledgement that we recognize you. There have been speculations especially in the Israeli media, that, for example, overflights might be extended. There could be direct flights for Hajj pilgrims from Israel to Saudi Arabia, sort of small things like that, that would improve the relationship. We've gotten no indications really from the Saudis where they stand on such things. I think there have also been quiet visits, both by officials and businessmen that have been reported in various local media, and I think that's also there's a direction of travel, but I don't know. I'm not sure really on this trip, the president's trip. I mean, I think it's significant that it's symbolic that he'll be flying directly from Israel to Saudi Arabia. It's not clear to me yet how far that relationship will develop, in the next month.
President Biden's visit takes place against a global energy crisis and high gas prices in the United States. What more, if anything, can Saudi Arabia do and is willing to do that would have an impact on gas prices?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia, since the beginning of the year, since the invasion of Ukraine, has been clear that it wants to stick to this oil production pact that it has with OPEC and Russia and other states. It wants to maintain stability in the markets, and it doesn't see much space for increasing production. And if it does so, it's going to do it within these sort of parameters. And they agreed recently to increase production a bit more, but that's unlikely to have a huge impact on oil prices. It's not entirely clear whether the Saudis could single-handedly do enough to bring down those prices. So for sure, that'll be part of the discussion that we've reported and have been hearing for months. That is a major topic of conversation, although not the only topic of conversation between American and Saudi officials. So I think it's definitely will be on the president's mind. I would suspect, given where prices and inflation are in the U.S. And it'll be really interesting to see if there's anything between now and the trip or after the trip that has a tangible kind of impact on that issue.
How is the oil windfall affecting Saudi development planning and its pandemic objectives of diversification of its oil resource and energy resources? You wrote about this earlier this month in the Journal. Give us the view from Riyadh, as oil revenues are extremely high. How has that affected their development planning?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting topic. I spoke with the finance minister a few weeks ago, and he's been trying for months, if not years, to try to insulate the Saudi budget from the boom and bust cycle, which it has experienced over many decades, in which oil prices go up and they spend a ton on big projects, and then oil prices collapse and they have to cut back, and then you've got these sort of half-finished projects. And so he's trying to bring a bit more kind of regularity and predictability to that, and it seems like for the moment that's holding. The idea that he sketched out to me was the Saudis will hold on to any sort of surplus that they accrue from high oil prices for the entire year, and then at the end of the year they'll figure out how much of that needs to go to foreign reserves and other kind of buffers in the financial system to ensure they can pay their bills, and then how much of that goes to PIF and for what projects, or the National Development Fund and for what projects. And they're going to try to bring more kind of scrutiny, so that when they do increase spending, it's for a very specific purpose. So I think a lot of these giga projects that they call them, the NEOM and the Red Sea project and others, will likely continue to be well funded. They may accelerate towards the end of the year if they get some of this. They see some of this new oil money, but basically the Saudis are saying they're trying to create a bit more of a professionalized process of accounting for and spending this money, so that it doesn't just go into whatever somebody wants at the moment. And the other point on this is that the Saudis have been trying to crack down on corruption, which a lot of the big oil revenues often sort of fell through the cracks. And so this is the first time really since, I guess prices went up a few years ago, but they haven't been this high basically since the vision was announced. So it'll be an interesting test, I think, of how they spend and how they maintain their sort of fiscal discipline when oil prices are back up.
Stephen, you're based there in Riyadh. Tell us about the mood in the kingdom, the social and economic changes of the past 5 to 10 years, and what is the buzz in the kingdom among young people, the private sector, about the direction of the country?
I think it's hard to generalize, of course, and there's lots of there's lots of diversity, But I would say one takeaway that I've had is in a period of the past 2 years in which the whole world had gone through the coronavirus pandemic, and lots of governments struggled to respond. Saudi, I think I've heard from a lot of Saudis is that they feel really comfortable and confident in the way their government responded. At times, the lockdown was more severe than some folks wanted it to be. It may have impacted the local economy in certain ways, but I think a lot of people feel like they have confidence the government took moves to protect people from the pandemic, and it never really got very bad. In Saudi, there was a moment where ICUs were getting close to capacity, but it was never really it never felt as dire as in some of the big hotspots in the world. And there continue to be a lot of social reforms and openness and things, changing on a sort of weekly, if not daily basis. New kind of social things coming up. Just events and music and concerts and things that improve the daily lives of a lot of people. And then on the flip side, we've also noticed that the cost of living has gone up. As the whole world struggles with inflation, so does Saudi. And I think because of the way that they've cut subsidies and increased taxes, for some people, prices have gone up quite a bit. And some people are having a hard time. So I would say it's mixed, but it's definitely a very different place than it was socially when I arrived 5 years ago.
Stephen, thank you for taking the time today to talk about Saudi Arabia. Your articles in the Wall Street Journal are required reading for those of us following the region and the kingdom. Again, with appreciation to you for joining us today on the Middle East.
My pleasure. Always good to talk to you, Andrew.
We will return after this break.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber and Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest, Stephen Kalin, and our production team of Beowulf Rockland and Rosabelle Hine of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all 3 of our Al Monitor podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel, whose guest this month is renowned Israeli-French artist and playwright Amos Gittai. On Israel with Ben Caspit, where Ben this week speaks with Shivi Greenfield of the Jewish Agency. And of course, this podcast On the Middle East, where I will be here next week with another decision maker or thought leader in the region. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the Middle East at almonitor.com.